I'm BrianVee, and this is Why We Work. Today, I have the great pleasure of speaking with Shaun Alspach. He is the Vice President of Influencing Generations for Christ. He is also the head of the school at Halifax Christian Academy in Nova Scotia, Canada. I want to find out how hard it is to be the head of the school, to be the principal, to be the leader, to help build it up. But I also want to know what he says about building up people and how should we do that each and every day. Join me in my conversation with Shaun Alspach. I'm BrianVee, and this is Why We Work. Today, I have the great pleasure of speaking with Shaun Alspach. Good day, fine sir.
Oh, good day, Brian. It's good to see you.
It's good to see you and to speak with you today. I thank you for your time for doing this. It's been, I guess it was 2018 when I left, and so we're 2021, so we're already at 3
Yeah,
years. Time does keep ticking.
time flies, and I miss seeing you in person as much as I used to. But it's my pleasure to be with you today.
And I thank you. What I'm starting to do, I just started it today. I usually say, what's this about? What are you about? What are you doing? But what industry are you in? And what is it that you're doing now, Shaun?
That's an interesting question, and even the word industry. I'm really in a ministry now, Brian. I work with a group called Influencing Generations for Christ, a Christian believer, born again Christian. But that's been a relatively recent change in my life, now in my 50s. That didn't happen until I was in my 30s.
Mm-hmm.
I'm with IGC for short, Influencing Generations for Christ. And what we do is we pour into private Christian schools around the world, trying to strengthen them in their mission, vision, operations, financial capabilities. Why do we do that? We pour into them because they're the ones impacting the next generation, hence the name Influencing Generations for Christ. So is it an industry? Education obviously has aspects that are like industry, but it's not for a profit motive. It's
Mm-hmm.
for an eternal profit motive in a Christian lens. So that's what I've been doing. I've been working with them for 5 years. Gosh, now going on 6 years. You're right, time's flying. I'm actually the head of school of one of IGC's former clients, Halifax Christian Academy here in Halifax, Nova Scotia. That's what brought me east, and I got to meet you in that process once we landed. So I'm pleased and privileged to be the head of school. Think headmaster or superintendent or president of the Christian Academy here in Halifax.
Shaun, I'd like to get more into that in a moment, but what would have been your very first job? Maybe as a
Oh,
teenager?
yeah. I was reflecting upon that. My mother actually sent me an email last week, and she was trying to remember the name of this place. My longest friend, his parents opened up an ice cream restaurant in the town in Alberta that I grew up in. And we were all underage to go get a legitimate job. So we
Mm-hmm.
all went to wash dishes in the back. And as long as we didn't come out front where the customers were, we were fine. And I
Yeah.
think we probably got paid, I don't know. I'd be surprised if it was $3 an hour.
How old were you then?
I think I was 13.
Okay.
13 but we got paid whenever the actual regular employees screwed up a big sundae or something. It always went in the freezer. So let's just say we ate a lot of ice cream after our shifts were over. That was kind of our pay.
What was the reasoning you got that job? Was it directly because your friend said, "Hey, come, we can get you some ice
Yeah.
cream and some money," or?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we lived on the same street, and you can only play so much baseball and football and shinny hockey if you're Canadian. Although some Canadians would dispute that. They'd play shinny hockey for 10 hours a day if they could. And honestly, it was that logical transition. We're capable. It wouldn't be bad to have a few dollars in your pocket. And the opportunity was there, and it was easy. And so I just kind of fell into it because of my friend. We didn't do it for very long, but it was 6 months or so, and it kind of got our feet wet in what a real job looks like, and it certainly got our hands dirty for sure.
What would have been your first legitimate job after that, after you got your hands dirty?
Yeah, I worked, I mean, as a kid, I really put myself through, during the high school years and into university, I worked at the golf course that I was a member of. I worked on first of all, in the pro shop, cleaning members' golf clubs and getting them ready to go, washing carts and kind of all the menial sort of tasks that are needed to keep a golf course running smoothly for the members. And then I graduated. It was, if you want to step up in wage and in responsibility, you join the grounds crew. So for those of us that are old enough, not quite like that old movie Caddyshack, but
Well, they were the cool guys. I was a
yeah,
course marshal in the Sackville Par 3 course
there you
back in
go.
the day. And the grounds crew, and just knowing a couple of friends of mine who worked in some of the other bigger courses, and the grounds crew, they're the cool guys.
Yeah, it was actually a great job. I mean, you got to spend time, in God's creation every single day. And although I'll tell you, it certainly destroyed me for working really early in the day. We
Hmm.
were on our mowers probably in northern Alberta. I mean, it got light at 5 in the morning, 5:30 in the morning, and you had to be out ahead of the golfers, of
Before
course.
the first tee off, and those
Right.
guys, you got to be up really early to get them wormed.
So I remember, running lawnmowers, big industrial lawnmowers at 4:30 in the morning with the headlights on. And so you can imagine what time we were getting up in the morning. And
Those are
but a great
that's a pretty good job though.
it
Being in a
was.
full 18 course, was it an 18 hole
Yeah.
course? Yeah, so
Yeah.
those are pretty good jobs to have into high school.
It was pretty steady. Caused a few things for me, which leads into some of my work career. I was
Mhm,
always living life kind of one chapter ahead.
mhm.
So unfortunately, I had a good job to go to, and I really didn't focus much on high school. I got good marks, but I was rushing through high school. So I finished high school in 2.5 years instead of three, really.
So what
And
was driving you to finish a chapter ahead? What were you looking forward to?
yeah, always, setting my sights ahead, but probably for the wrong reasons, to be honest. In high
Mhm.
school, it would have been, you know what, university's looming. I need to go make a bunch of money just to pay tuition.
Okay.
So, didn't really engage much with high school peers except for a few. And the goal was to finish early so that spring, instead of going to high school, I could go to the golf course and make some money.
Right.
So, yeah, that really was an economic driver just to try and pay tuition for that first year of university.
Since you were looking ahead, what were you thinking about even from high school as a career? So what did you take in college?
Yeah, I have a Bachelor of Science in geology, ironically, which is a great position to do Christian ministry from, because people would have you believe that science and the Bible are incompatible. And I've lived on both sides of that equation, and I
Hmm.
can tell you, and I'm joyous that they're extremely compatible. But of course,
Sure.
I didn't know that back then.
Yeah.
So I was interested in the sciences and the maths. I
Would
wasn't
you say, sorry, would you say because you were working on the golf course, you had that more ecological sort of outlook? Was that kind of what you saw at that point?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, I was fascinated with the complexity of the earth that we live on, just the
Mhm.
systems. And of course, in your normal grade school training, the biosphere and the ecosystems, you learn all that.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean, I lived in Alberta. The Rocky Mountains
Mhm.
are relatively close. It's just anybody that lives in a mountainous area, the majesty of the mountains in themselves is captivating when you consider. Um, so it was really, it wasn't like I got a lot of career guidance and counseling to make that
Mhm.
choice. In fact, kind of fell into it. Was arguing with myself whether I wanted to go into engineering or geology. Actually, ironically, started in engineering for the first semester, which makes me a very stereotypical geologist. There's a lot of geologists that are geologists because they kind of washed out of calculus in engineering, and I actually was like that. I struggled with calculus, and
Mhm.
but I went in with kind of a dual mindset. So I had my courses aligned that I could choose one or the other.
So as a studying geology for ignorant people like myself, what would your career paths possibly look like versus what you actually did?
Right. Well, several fold. Geology is a very, I mean, obviously there's the earth is everywhere. So lots of different possibilities. Mining geology is certainly traditionally huge. Obviously we need copper, we need, metals, we need these raw materials for a lot of the things we manufacture.
Hmm.
So there's mining, oil and gas, natural gas, fossil fuel geology, trying to extract fossil fuels from the earth in a responsible manner. Water, hydrogeology is obviously huge, fundamental of life. That leads itself into a whole different branch of geology. It's extremely wide ranging actually. It's diversity.
How did
And
you start to narrow your focus down and into your career?
yeah, probably second or third year in university, I had an uncle that was in the oil and gas, the energy business,
Hmm.
and he was an influence on my life. And I lived in a town where there was none of that. It wasn't an oil and gas center, but he kind of piqued my interest in it, and I ended up going down that road. I was in the energy business for close to 20 years, probably more than 20 years now, actually. So,
So what made you transition into more of a ministry? So rather than the industry into the ministry?
right. Well, there's an extremely long story, which I won't obviously not
Well, we
appropriate
we
for
just
today.
jumped 20 decades or 2 decades
Yeah,
just right there.
yeah, that was a pretty big jump. You know, did wasn't raised in a strongly Christian home.
Mhm.
Really was kind of ambivalent to all of the worldviews. To this day, still have friends professing in most of the major worldviews. Really wasn't too immersed in it until in my early 30s. And my wife and I started dating, and it was very fundamental to her, that faith foundation. And I mean, you don't know what you don't know. It's that
Yeah.
simple. I was willing to walk in to that arena, if you will, as a secular, non-believing geologist, which I guess if you give me any credit, at least I was willing to walk into it.
Mm.
And, to
Oh,
be honest,
look at this
I
place.
was there was a lot of that. I was intimidated. I was scared. And of what? What was I so scared of? And that's a whole story in itself. Whatever I thought, church was from
Mhm.
television, probably.
Yeah.
And of course, what I found was nothing like what I was fearing. It was pleasant and good people, and certainly some challenging thoughts to my ad hoc worldview, I suppose. And over the course of time, I tested it. I'm a scientist first and foremost. I really did put.
Oh, come on, Shaun. Not real science doesn't believe in
I
Christianity. Come
put
on.
I put Christianity to the test. I
Yeah,
wasn't, there is no such thing as blind faith,
I
but
know.
I would have said that at the time.
Mhm.
And for me, it was an intellectual exercise first. That's not the same for everybody, but for me, that's the way it was. After 20 years of chasing the corporate dream and doing some big things and some successful things and some things that were dismal failures, of course, you learn more through the failures. My heart, I guess, was prepared for something different, and but I didn't treat it lightly. I actually did a critical analysis of Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism. And at the end of the day, the overwhelming evidence to adopt the Christian worldview, in my eyes, was just that, overwhelming. And of course, then I had an intellectual integrity problem. If I ran a science experiment that tested a hypothesis and 200 times in a row, it can the experiment prove the hypothesis, what conclusion would I draw? I would draw a conclusion that the hypothesis is true,
True.
and I'd stop experimenting. I wouldn't need 200 more iterations of the same result. And that's really where I got to in my faith discovery, I
A lot of
suppose.
people do that. They keep testing more. Like,
Right.
wait a
I
second, there's
finally,
something else over here.
after a year and a half of testing and seeking data and accounts and proofs, independent proofs, not using the Christian Bible, but using extra biblical sources from actually anti-Christian sources that also back this up. The historicity of it, for example. At the end of the day, I really realized that if I didn't accept this, I was kind of committing. I was being a hypocrite, I guess, intellectually, but kind of committing intellectual suicide, because I would never do that with a science experiment, a chemistry experiment.
So was all of this going on while you were in oil and gas?
Yeah. The discovery was while I was still a senior executive in the oil and gas complex. And your original question was, how did I end up in ministry? And until I tell you step one of how did I end up being Christian, it really doesn't make any sense to answer the second one.
Absolutely.
I was standing, it's a very personal story. And again, we don't have the time today to go into it in detail, but I was standing in Jerusalem, in Israel, and a few conflicting thoughts hit my head all at the same time, and I really couldn't process it in real time. So really just a sentiment of, why have you been chasing this corporate dream for so long? And I'm a recovering workaholic. Sometimes I have a relapse. The industry that I ended up in certainly rewards you for going that extra mile, and that was kind of applauded. And any insecure young professional, they're looking for affirmation, sometimes in all the wrong places. For me, that manifests itself as a workaholic. I was pouring my life into my downtown career. And, by all accounts, I was deemed to be successful, and the pay raises seemed to indicate the same. And, it seemed to be going along, but at what cost? And so, really the Lord gave me a kind of a poke in the ribs, if you will. Obviously that's not accurate. It's just kind of a fun visual for me. And just kind of said, hey, why are you doing this? Why are you chasing this dream? And why aren't you serving me? And then, do you want to be healed? And that's a passage out of the Bible. Do you want to be healed? Where Jesus actually healed a lame man that had been sitting lame for 30 years, and a tremendous miracle. And little did anybody know, but I was undergoing tests for a very significant health scare. And so, but God knew that. And so he found 3 ways to hit my head in a very relevant way for me. And I'll tell you, that'll get your attention, especially when you're standing in Jerusalem of all places. So that was really the door opening to consider something new. Something more aligned to serving him and maybe not chasing the dollar. And that led into a ministry career. I didn't start in ministry with IGC. I actually started volunteering at my local church as a ministry assistant. And you've done some of that in your background. And it's an amazing role because you get to learn from experienced professionals, but it's in a safe environment. They've kind of got your back, and it's kind of the old apprentice model, and it works. And so I did that for 3 years. And of course, my heart for going back hardcore into downtown life had waned after that 3 years. So that was, kind of the transition. It wasn't an overnight thing. It was a slow walk, sometimes a quick run, but all in the same direction.
So as you did make that transition into influencing generations for Christ, it was soon thereafter you took the headship at Halifax Christian Academy. So was that kind of one and the same, going to this will also lead to the other?
Yeah, it was about a year and a half, almost 2 years of working with IGC. And the IGC model is we're always going to a school. So it's a lot of travel. Obviously, right now with COVID, it's not as prevalent as it used to be, a little more difficult to get where we need to go. But I was able and blessed to be able to sit with I wasn't a founder of IGC, but I was able to travel with some of the founding members who had more experience. I had some school leadership experience just from my own children's schools, but I had some useful tools apparently. But I got to follow them around for a year and a half, and over that time, that was kind of my apprenticeship there. And I learned, and there was a lot of patterns within the private education, Christian education system, and that equipped me I didn't move to Halifax to become the head of school at Halifax Christian Academy. I moved here to actually help a mutual friend of ours not burn out in ministry, because I had lived that in Alberta. I'd helped a couple pastors by being a good volunteer, not burn out.
That's what I remember. Before meeting you, I was told you were coming to help, right?
Right.
You were coming to help, and then kind of looking around, and then this other position came up.
Right. And so, God had a different plan. And of course, I hope I've helped at my local church, and only God knows. But I've tried to be a useful servant, and not in the role that I envisioned when we moved all the way across Canada to come to Halifax. And God had a different plan. So the school at Halifax Christian Academy, which I was familiar with and had been trying to help from afar a little bit, was struggling. Just to be honest, it was it was at risk of closure. And once I got here, some very concerned and very dedicated parents reached out to me and basically presented the crisis and asked for the assistance of IGC, but that was really through me because I was the one here.
You're a spokesman, yeah.
Yeah, and I have a whole team behind me in IGC, so I look smart by extension. The toolkit is very full. Of course, I knew where to look in the tool belt for the right tools, and so I again look smart by extension. But it's not me; I'm the face of it, sure, but there's a whole team behind me, and I think most people that are watching will resonate with them. That it takes a team, and that's the case here as well.
Shaun, I've been teaching for over 10 years now, but knowing some of the schools that I went to, even in Halifax, I've always had an eye for the principal, or more so the vice principal position for me. So the principal or the head of the school position is an interest to me to see how they move and work. Can you comment on how you said it was difficult when you got there? I believe that you guys are doing much better. You can say exactly how.
Oh yeah, complete transformation.
How difficult is it to build and to maintain from your position a school such as Halifax Christian Academy?
Yeah, that's a great
to build
question.
them up.
Yeah, I appreciate you asking it. I won't sugarcoat it. It's extremely difficult. Even with the blessing of the Lord, which I feel Halifax HCA for short, HCA is blessed, it's been an inordinate amount of labor. And when we think about it, even with God's blessing, He expects us to participate. In fact, He invites us to participate. He could do it. He could snap His proverbial fingers and transform it, but we learn in the process and we grow in the process. And sometimes when we're challenged, I don't know if it's the same for you, but definitely for me, when I've been challenged in life, walking with Him, is actually some of the times when I grow the most in my trust, in my peace. Things that really the world, especially these days, I mean, it doesn't seem like a very peaceful world. And so those are some of the lessons that I've learned in the extreme challenging times. Sometimes, I am not perfect. No Christian is. That's why we need Him. But I have learned a little bit more to trust in Him. And HCA had to learn the same things. And, solid teachers, solid foundation. But unfortunately, and organizationally, maybe this is useful for some watching, that strong foundation in Christian circles, obviously that's Jesus. But even in the secular workplace, if you're and I've seen this in my corporate career, if the foundation of your company is not strong, it's really difficult to launch and implement and succeed with a phase of growth.
Mm.
It's really, when you look at building a skyscraper, you spend more time on the foundation and it doesn't look like you're doing much. It's pilings, it's lots of concrete, it's solidifying the base. And of course, from the outside, it just looks like a big hole in the ground.
Just a lot of noise.
Impressive. But then, of course, once that foundation's solid, all of a sudden the floors start going up pretty quickly. Mm. And that's the visual that I prefer with HCA and other schools, is sometimes we just need to pour a lot of concrete in the foundation and shore that up. And then, then we can build. And whether we're going to build a 3-story apartment block or a 30-story, high rise, that's up to the Lord. And so that's really the transformation at HCA. It's been an inordinate amount of work. It's not just me. In 3.5 years, I'm probably into it for, 11,000 hours. Again, just to be real. Mm-hmm. Heavy lift is heavy. But I'm not the only one. It's been a whole team. But Shaun, the Lord gives us a direction. You can lift all day long, but where are you lifting to? And maybe that's useful to some that are watching. Until you align the team, nobody would have a tug of war with everybody pulling in a different direction on their side of the rope. You have to be able to pick up the rope. First of all, locate it, then be willing to pick it up. Sometimes in business, that's the 2 hardest things. How do we even locate the rope? And, I've helped some companies with this too, this kind of visioning, strategic planning. How do we find the rope? And then are we willing and courageous enough to pick it up? Because that's really the engagement with the mission, whatever it may be. And then are we willing to pull with all of our might? We say we are quite often, but are we really? And that's the only way we can succeed, or else we're going to get pulled into the mud if you go back to a kids camp kind of analogy. So,
Shaun, ever since I have known you, or since I've known you, and even knowing why you went to Halifax, I see you as a person who's able to build people up. And I think that's what you're doing in the school. So how is it that you do so? And how important is that in the workplace? Building people up.
Thank you, Brian, for mentioning that. That embarrasses me a little bit, but thank you for that.
That's true, but you're welcome.
I appreciate that. The goal of a good manager, I believe, and I've worked for some in my corporate career that were amazing, and I've worked for some that unfortunately weren't so amazing. The goal of a good manager is, frankly, to, as quickly as possible, find who's going to replace them. I believe, and my staff would laugh because I use quite often the analogy that if I got hit by a bus, unfortunately, hopefully there's a good party, to celebrate a life well lived. But that aside, who would be instantly able to step in so that the organization, in my current context, the ministry, doesn't suffer? Or if it suffers a little, just because transitions are hard, it doesn't shake that foundation to the core. Mm-hmm. And that's been one of my motivators as long as I've been a manager. And because of that, I'm always trying to discover, sometimes it's easy, sometimes not so easy, discover who those new leaders, that next half generation, people that have gifts that have never been encouraged. And so I'm always looking for that next, as I say, half generation to take over. And some of the team at Halifax Christian Academy, if they ever watch this, they know who they are. Mm. So being able to communicate that with integrity and openness, not to put pressure, but just to enable and empower people to dream a little bigger. And you can only do that by lifting them up. There's no way you're going to encourage somebody to take over an organization if you've got your oppressive thumb over them. That's just not going to work. So you have to breathe a little oxygen into the organization. And sometimes that gets messy. And there's certainly been people that have taken advantage of me because of that approach. Mm-hmm. because I've kind of loosened the reins, and then all of a sudden they start to go the other way, and they're taking advantage, and they're not really being diligent. And of course, no judgment. It's just the way some people are wired.
Mm-hmm.
If you give them space, they'll find ways to avoid actually pulling on the rope. But for the most part, I've been, I'm very encouraged. So it's easy to try and build people up when you've had so many great examples of that being a joy in your past experience. So, and I love working with youth because, of course, their canvas is wide open at the moment. And this current role gives me the ability to do both.
Besides building people up, what is the process of the head of the school? What does that look like generally for schools, whether principals or the dean?
Yeah, in a private school setting, and not even just private Christian school, you don't typically have a large school board above you. And a public school board, publicly funded school board, would do everything from budgets to human resources, payroll. So all of those functions typically get foisted upon a principal. A principal, as you will know, Brian, better than I, principals usually are groomed from your teaching faculty. So they're usually the better teachers. And then they get promoted to the vice principalship, which is kind of usually a hybrid role, administrative plus, a little bit of frontline connection. And then, of course, you get promoted because you're a good vice principal into a principalship. Once you're a principal, you just lost your mission field because you have very limited connection with the students. That's a totally different role. And the skill set that made you an exemplary teacher and an excellent vice principal is now no longer necessarily your go-to skill set. Classroom management. Well, when you're a principal, you don't have one. You're mentoring. But in a private setting, all of the added things, budget, client relations, governance, how to build a board, how to, what are our bylaws? How about our marketing plan? Again, in a private school setting, you need a marketing plan because you need students, or else you don't have a school. And they're not by law mandated to come to your school. So all of those kind of non-traditional educator roles end up being foisted upon a principal. And of course, what do you think the percentage of principal burnout is? It's gigantic. Well, then, of course, now you've taken an already stressed school, and you're only giggling because you can see where I'm going. And, even if you're here, now your principal burns out and it starts a spiral.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, and it breaks my heart, I've seen good schools spiral to very deep, dark depths. And so having a head of school is basically the best friend to the principal. The principal gets to maintain what they're best at, encouraging staff and professional development and long-range planning and curriculum, and yes, some student discipline and some of the things that are core to a well functioning school. But they're not burdened with all those non-classroom things, is how I put it. So the head of school is really more like the president, if you were to use a corporate analogy.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of client relations, a lot of strategic planning, a lot of vision work, a lot of partnership work. HR would fall under me, budget would fall under me. And again, my principal currently at HCA loves the fact that they don't have to worry about the budget. And it makes them more effective in their role. And again, effectiveness is what is attractive to people, no matter where you're working. If you're effective in what you do, people will be interested in learning more.
I'm shocked whenever I look for jobs or to see what the teaching market is, there's almost a 1-for-1 teaching position and principal position. So
right.
I think that burnout is pretty high.
Yeah, that's why. And yeah, if you ever wanted to be a principal in a Christian school, Brian, I'm pretty sure I know where to put you. Quite a few different places.
Shaun, what would you say is a skill set that you had to develop as you moved into this position most recently or in the last few years?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I haven't done a ton of reflection on that, but definitely some key learnings, patience being the first. In the corporate setting, I've run publicly traded companies on stock markets. Every day you get a scorecard. Every day your stock chart goes up, goes down. Every day there's another pressure upon you. And I think that's why in corporate life, so many people do burn out. Because you're continually under the microscope. Those indicators don't exist per se in the same way in a ministry setting, let alone in a Christian school setting. It's not a daily review, and you don't have 20 stock analysts scrubbing down your numbers every 90 days when you put out a quarterly report. And the knives can fire pretty quickly in that world. Now the bouquets, if you're doing a good job, also flow it's very straight up. If you're doing well, they'll tell you, and if you're not doing well, that's not great, right? Well, in ministry, what are those leading indicators? You don't, cash flow accretion and revenue expansion and all the things that we use in our business lives. What's expansion look like in a ministry setting? Well, as much as I kid around about, you can't get that to a Microsoft Excel or Google Sheet. 2 decimal points of precision. There it is right there. Like, there's our expansion. It's it's much more esoteric. It can be sensed, it can be felt, and eventually it can be quantified. But the lag time from sensing it to quantifying it is a lot longer in ministry. So I had to learn patience. And I had to learn that.
Yeah, go ahead.
In the corporate life, typically, at least traditionally, training programs were pretty robust. I entered work life in the early 1990s, which gives everybody an indication of how old I am now. But
only young chap, only young.
Bless you. But in modern context, nowadays you can train up notionally, watching 10 YouTube videos. Like, training has become much more dynamic, but no less critical. And so in corporate life, if you needed to be trained back in my day, the company went, yeah, no problem, let's get that done. In ministry, training is kind of through the school of doing. Obviously academic training, but the experiential training takes time. And in corporate life, you always ran with a baseline of people are already well trained by the time they get to your company. And then, of course, you're continuing on with that training. In ministry life, that is not monolithic in any way, shape, or form, because training takes so many different forms in ministry. So they may be extremely well trained in this bandwidth of ministry, but now you're asking them to cover this much bandwidth. Well, how do you identify, usually with a small ministry team, the gap? How do you resource into the gap? Unfortunately, ministries do struggle with financial and manpower resources. Everybody's time is stressed, so volunteerism is down, for example. How do you train into that gap so that you can have a well-functioning ministry? I had to learn that once I went into ministry, because my assumption coming out of corporate life is people are already well-trained. And of course, ministry is a much more emotional undertaking. Business is emotional. Certainly we rise and fall, and anybody that's in a public company, sometimes we do rise and fall with our stock chart, which isn't, admirable. It's just the way it is in some ways. But in ministry, it's much more emotional. There's a person behind the incident. There's an interaction behind the offense, and it's meant to be it's a people industry, if you will. Yep. It's not a manufacturing industry or a Silicon Valley startup. It's a people industry. And because of that, patience and trying to figure out where the gaps are so you can address them becomes a more difficult undertaking. First, to have patience personally, and then to have patience while you're figuring out the gaps. That's the biggest lesson I've had to learn in
We
ministry.
can't put patience in our pocket and say, yeah, I got that right here.
Amen to that.
And
Yeah,
the other way too, I think that makes it emotional and maybe more solid, and just a more as you talked about the skyscraper, more foundational approach to doing work in this ministry, is you have that underlying grace and forgiveness. So allowing people who don't know to learn, to give them the time, or whoever did an offense, or the parents that are coming in and they hopefully are bringing their kids in for the good reason that you're representing on your mission statement or your vision, the reason why, and they're in a full-blown investment in this, not, as you mentioned, you're not required to go to this school, right? And then you're looking at more of the numbers, even in a school in that sort of setting, but you have people who have a heart for their children to get a full, well-rounded education, and for the teachers to grow along with them and understanding, no, you can't just have this. This is a lifelong journey for all of us here.
right. That's well said. God has infinite resources, but he gives us a finite amount of resources. And if nothing else, a 24-hour day and the need to sleep, at least some, should show us that we have a finite set of resources. If we tried to go 24/7, eventually we would really crash. We have a finite set of resources. What are we choosing to invest those resources in? That could be your time, your experience, your financial blessings. And in ministry, what I find is people are very willing to consider making those investments of their resources. But you have to continually keep aligning to people to the rope. There's the rope, pick it up. Well, no, I want to pick up that rope over there. Well, no, that's not where we're at. That's not who we are. That's an awesome idea. And if you want to go serve in that charity instead, awesome. Please, like, how do we help? But no, this is our rope. This is what we're pulling on, and this is why. So once aligned, it's a beautiful thing. People have a tremendous amount of talent. They have to see a rowing team, if you will. Think of an Olympic rowing team where they only have one oar, and there might be 7 other oarsmen or women in the boat. Well, if one of them gets out of rhythm, they're done. That's the end of the race. It's a great visual, but they didn't start that way. When they were 8 years old and somebody put them in one of these huge boats that tips over about as easy as you can imagine, you know what? I bet you they got wet from time to time. Yeah. And it didn't look like a well-oiled machine. That came with time and training and reminders.
And then you get some, oh, this is heavy. This is heavy.
Right. And they're getting up at 6 a.m. before school to go practice, and it's raining. It takes dedication, and but that continual alignment. And that's the one thing from not the only thing, but one of the major things from my corporate career that apparently was useful in ministries. And so strategic planning, governance work, visioning, I do a lot of that because ministries need that too. And each ministry has its own niche. It has its own subset of the greater mission. So yeah, it's been a joy to see people align, pick up the rope and pull, keeping them pulling in the same direction. In times of crisis, that's actually quite easy. Right? If somebody skids off the road, what's the mission? Are the people okay? If not, get help. And 3, get the car out of the ditch. The mission's actually quite simple to define in a crisis. When you're back on the road, now there's 100 different roads leading in 100 different directions. It's sometimes most challenging to lead when you're not in a crisis situation. And that is something I've learned over the years in all of the ups and downs of corporate life and ministry life. And so that's where it's doubly important to make sure everybody knows where the rope is and how to pull on it, because then when things stabilize, everybody keeps pulling on the same rope. And maybe you can pull a little more efficiently, and maybe there's a few more people to pull on it, but you're still pulling in the same direction. And ultimately, you'll have organizational success that way.
Shaun, how are you pulling the rope in that? How are you maintaining your productivity? How are you, and what's getting your feet on the floor
Right.
each
Personally,
day?
Brian, is that what you're referring to? Actually, complete transparency, after 3.5 years, I hit the wall in December. Actually had a little mini breakdown. Just, had gone too far into the well, and the well was dry. Had a couple personal crisis deaths that triggered it in December. And just didn't have the resiliency. So a caution to those hard driving individuals that might be watching. Learn from my big time mistakes, and I've made a lot of them. You have to be, what's filling your tank?
Yep.
It has to be something. You can't keep drawing and giving and pouring out, because eventually you'll be empty. And that may feel good, and people may be affirming you because you're doing such a great job or you're working so hard. Those can lead to great despair. It can feel good in the moment. It certainly does massage your pride from time to time, maybe cover some insecurity. Like I mentioned in my early days in corporate life, you're the lowest man on the totem pole. You work really hard because you don't want to get fired. It's that simple. Some of those insecurities live a lot longer than your early days in corporate life. What are you covering it with? And then what are you filling it with? Is that, trusted set of friends that you can go to early? Mental health, depression, anxiety is that's really the pandemic of the world, over and above COVID. And so what are you doing to fill your tank? So I hit the wall in December. And I just drew too hard. And then a couple of crises, I realized I had nothing left. I just had no resiliency. So that's my caution. But on a positive front, what do I do to stay productive? For me, when you're forward looking, I get blamed for being a visionary. Now, I've worked for visionaries that couldn't develop a plan to realize that vision if you gave them all the resources in the world. Those I call dreamers. They're just dreaming. And it's not bad if you partner a dreamer with kind of a doer. Sometimes, for every tech startup, there's usually somebody that's the visionary dreamer, and then there's somebody in the background coding like crazy, right? You need both. But actually, I get blamed for being a visionary because I have a dream and a vision for where the ministry could go. But then my corporate background, I'm able to put a framework of a plan around it. So when I'm most productive, I'm equally balancing those two major tasks. There's a vision, and then I go a little bit more granular and go, okay, I'm not going to get it right, but what would a plan look like to maybe take it there? And then I share that with my team open-handedly and say, hey, do you hate this idea? Is this the dumbest thing ever? And if they say, no, this actually is a pretty good idea, then I can hand them a plan that isn't, I always say the cement is still wet. You can shape it and move it. It's not a vacuum, but hey, shape it, make it better. Well, of course, you do that 2-3 times, and now they feel part of it. But not all of your team are initiators, right? Ideation people are a precious commodity, but they need to be coupled to implementers. And so when I'm most productive, I've got some kind of balance between those two. That's my major focus. And then, of course, in a Christian school, every once in a while, it's not a bad thing to, be able to get a hug from a kid in grade 2. That'll keep you motivated for quite some time. Obviously, with COVID, it's not where we used to be, but yeah, I get my tank gets filled in many, many different ways, and that helps me stay productive.
Speaking of kids, and as you were an ice cream dishwasher, uh,
That's right.
getting into work for the first time, and people who change their career as you have, and as many people do you have any
Yeah.
tips for people just getting into work or changing their careers?
Yeah, no, that's great. No, don't be afraid to change careers. I've had several. I taught at a university for 10 years part-time. I've tried many different things. At one point, I thought I was going to be a teaching professional golfer back in the day when I was golfing all the time. I would advise, and from my own experience, don't restrict yourself from dreaming a little. Like, if you're a great swimmer and you're 12, and you know what, dream of the Olympics.
Mhm,
It's okay, but don't make your identity become, hey, I'm going to be an Olympic swimmer,
mhm,
because obviously a thin percentage of people that are very exemplary swimmers are ever going to make the Olympics. The same is true. I'm gonna start the greatest thing since sliced bread in the high tech space. I'm gonna live in Silicon Valley, and we're gonna sell it to somebody for $1 billion. Well, of course, those are the stories we know. What about the thousands of equivalent stories that failed miserably and people lost houses, right? Because they had to mortgage their house to get the startup funds to even give it a go. So I guess my advice would be, don't be afraid to dream. And on occasion, that dream will become a reality and a door will swing open. For me, it was into ministry, for example. And for everybody listening, I'm sure they have instances that were equivalent. Okay, if you've dreamed about it, you've thought about it, you obviously have a skill set. Don't be afraid to tiptoe through that door. And it may not end up being a career change. It could be a volunteer opportunity. It could be a ministry opportunity like mine, or it could be a corporate career change. But don't be afraid to tiptoe into it. But always make sure that you're not going to have to fully immerse yourself in it, because you'll lose yourself in the process. And then it's really hard to backpedal, to unwind that. Um, so that, I would say just don't be afraid of it, and keep dreaming, and then step into it.
Yeah, there's
And
lots of people who mention how difficult the question is for children or anyone. What do you want to be when you grow up? And I
right.
heard someone say, rather than ask that, just ask, what would you like to experience? What are some things you would
Mm,
like to experience while you're young or as you get older? And then try your hand in those things. And some things, if you excel at them, you go ahead. And some things that they
right.
fall on the wayside. That's perfect. Here in Korea, even in elementary school, and I'm sure it's the same all around the world, but parents will pick the elementary school based on where they want them to go to middle school, to go to high school, because they already have their university and their job picked out for them. And if it's a
Right.
career job, they're set that way. If a parent wants their kids to be an athlete, there's an athletic school. So they never go in that other lane of being an academic. It's
Right.
like from
And
an
yeah, I'm
elementary school.
familiar with that. Yeah. We have an international school at Halifax Christian Academy. And at the moment, a large percentage of our international students, well, before the borders all closed with
Hmm.
COVID, were actually Korean.
Hmm.
And so they come here, and of course, we don't have that approach.
Yeah,
It's
it's
more holistic.
freedom. Freedom.
You can try the basketball team, or
Yeah.
you can try calculus, or play in the band, pick up the flute, whatever you want to do.
Yeah.
And I have to say, Brian, for some students, especially our Korean students, that's a challenge,
Mm.
because it's so countercultural to what they've grown up in their first 8 to 10 years of grade school. And I'm very empathetic to their challenge. Sometimes choice is paralyzing, and I think you're right. I said don't be afraid to dream and try,
But for
but
some people, that's hard. Yeah.
for some that's hard, and I think we have to, a career, anything. I've been a middle manager in a manufacturing business for 35 years. And then unfortunately that business has hard times and there's layoffs. How
Mm.
many stories do you hear of individuals now middle-aged where that's their whole identity and they're scared to go retrain? Or worse, and this is my encouragement, what I've learned and might be encouraging to your listeners, your skills are more transferable than you will give yourself credit for.
Absolutely.
Guaranteed. You may not know where to transfer them to. That's fair enough. But no matter who's listening, your skills that you already have are more transferable than you will give yourself credit, because quite often we're our own worst critic.
Do you think, and I find this is true for myself, is that people have difficulty articulating their skills and showing that to other people versus, I know I can do X, Y, Z, but to express that and allow people to really have a good appreciation for what I could bring to the table, or what they can bring to the table. Do you think that's a barrier for people?
It's an interesting thought. You're probably right, and it may be rooted, just off the top of my head. It may be rooted in that, don't be prideful, don't brag. You're not good enough. Maybe a guilt complex from years ago. We're not really taught, and of course, we see the other side, the wanton self-promoter, where they invented Rice Krispies and Post-it notes, and they figured out how the combustion engine. Like, they're just so far off the cliff the other way. And we don't like that. Obviously, we repel that. And then we've kind of been taught, at least anybody that's in middle age has been taught, be humble, don't speak much about yourself, let your actions speak louder than your words. And then, of course, you get into that setting where you're trying to really promote your skills.
Sell yourself, yeah.
Right. And it really comes from a different, we're a square peg trying to fit into a round hole in that job interview, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, I think the middle ground, don't go here. I've obviously hired a lot and interviewed a lot, and unfortunately had to terminate a few over the years. It's the extreme positions that are the most vulnerable, actually. They might feel the safest, but it's okay to say, I'm not an expert in everything, but I'm an expert in this.
Mm-hmm.
And if this fits your needs, I would love to help you realize your mission.
What about also, Shaun, not so much an expert, but willing to improve in a particular area to meet your need?
Tremendous. I mean, absolutely essential. The world is changing so quick. The work world is changing so quick. The skills I took Fortran of all things back in university as a programming language. Well, good luck. Like, if I would have relied on my Fortran training, I
didn't see that on your LinkedIn profile.
Yeah, no, it's obviously. And, it's okay to take on a new challenge and learn how to learn. I think, that sounds cliche, but that's so key. So being willing to flex, I think, if obviously be true to yourself. There's people I've worked with that actually aren't willing to flex. They want to occupy this little box, and then you push them, that much further, and they get uncomfortable. But assuming you're not one of those folks, and that you're willing to flex and open your mind and take on some new challenges, convey that to your employer. This is I'm a subject matter expert here. I'm functional here, but, from the research I've done on your company, it looks like we might need to go there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay with that. I may never become the subject matter expert in this block, but I'm willing to pitch in because I see it as important to the greater success.
I think this next question about character. What is important as a teacher or as a head of school, or what do you see as a high quality character trait among people?
I don't know how many, teams I've been involved in and had the privilege of leading over the years. But character, the integrity being the biggest thing in that toolkit. Integrity being, what do you do when I used to say nobody was watching, and now
but someone's
only God's watching. if your team knows that you carry yourself with integrity, not perfect, but I'm going to work very hard to treat people with respect. And when I make a promise, I'm going to do everything I can to make sure I follow through. That builds people up and builds people together. And character is personal, but then there's also the character of the team.
Mm-hmm. The
How do we
cultures,
represent ourselves?
the words thrown around, the culture of the team
Right.
nowadays, the community.
Right. And of course, if there's corrupt character at an individual level, there will be corrupt culture in the organization. The character of an individual is really quite simple. I mean, honesty, integrity, these are all almost cliche because they're so self-evident. But to be honest, I think people, when they see them, are attracted to them. And certain individuals in all of our lives, as I speak, there's people that probably have a visual of a person in their mind that carried themselves with integrity and was honest. And when things
so refreshing to hear and to see people like that.
Right. And it stands apart, doesn't it? There's kind of this average. And, my father had a saying growing up that's always stuck with me. And he always used to say, Shaun, it's mathematically impossible for everybody to be above average. And that's something that's always stuck with me. And that's not a judgmental statement. We all have weaknesses. There's areas where, ask my wife, I'm sure I'm completely inept.
Ask my dear wife too.
Right. Anybody
but
that's
it's being
married,
open and honest too, right? Even from a Christian perspective,
right.
We struggle and we fail daily.
Right. But we don't live there. And not living in your failure. Character is actually going through a trial and not getting derailed. Can you go through a trial? When the pressure's on, what comes out? Do you start lying your face off? Do you start selling out your coworkers and throwing them under the bus because you're worried about getting fired? I'm making up very extreme examples, but it'll get people thinking.
Those things happen too. Those things happen all the time, and that's why having someone above average is refreshing and nice to see.
Right. And they might not be above average in their actual vocation, but they could be above average in their personal character. And of course, they make a huge contribution to the culture of the organization. You need core competencies, of course. Nobody's going to hire you because of, of the great jokes you tell in the coffee station. I mean, it's nice to have somebody that's funny in the team. So you need core competencies, but then how do you complement the rest of the team culturally is important as well.
I was thinking of asking this question, then I wasn't going to ask it, and then I am going to ask it about where you put education in the lives of people and how important is it, obviously, as the head of a school. So I was like, well, this is quite obvious, maybe that he's going to answer, but whether formal education or informal education, however it comes for people and listeners, and where do you place education?
You might be surprised with my answer. Education is absolutely crucial. But what I've seen is almost an idolatry to good marks. Well, anybody that's, our age, my age, how many things did you learn for about 24 hours because there was an exam that you have never used since? And if my students ever hear this, they'll probably
There's a way out. You mean I can do that too?
But I mean, situationally, there's things we need to learn, but we don't need to retain. And in life, that's true, right? But by the flip side, how many times have you needed to learn how to start a car? Once, twice? Those are lifelong lessons, right? Back in the day, it would have been how to drive using a clutch. Once you've learned it, you've learned it. You don't have to consciously make your foot move anymore. So my definition of education might be different. And unfortunately, with a system that's kind of designed for get the best marks, get the best marks, get the best marks, like you're saying in an extreme example in Korea.
This is vital in Korea.
Right. It's who you are. It's the only scorecard that matters when you're a student, sometimes. Now, of course, I've had interactions with students that have come to Canada from Korea, and they affirm that. And it becomes get great marks at all costs. And we've got, double working parents that never see their kids because the private school they're going to is $40,000 a year.
On a side note, I have kids outside playing here, and they're not singing songs, just any old songs. They're singing multiplication songs to one another.
Right. It can be all immersive is my point. So education, super critical.
Yeah.
What's our definition of education is where I would take us down a different path. When I failed in business, tremendously strong lessons learned, never to be lost again, but not success by a traditional definition. So is education extremely important? Absolutely it is, because it builds core competencies. Again, my Fortran example, I never used Fortran, never have used Fortran, didn't like Fortran, wasn't even sure why I was taking the course, but I learned how to get through a course that I thought was useless back then. And I stuck it out. So that steadfastness, that diligence, how to deal with despair when your Fortran term project won't compile on an ancient old computer. Right? How to deal with the stress of that, how to come out the other side and realize you're going to be fine. That's a bigger picture of education. Of course, then you add a faith component at a Christian school where there's a whole nother amazing discovery process ahead of you, which is who created me? Why does he love me? Why did he die for me? These are all amazing questions. And when you're 6, they're questions. And maybe by the time you're 16, you've got your answers. That's a whole nother level of education. And that's why I'm so attracted to what I'm doing now, because you couple the best of both worlds. But we learn more. The greatest example, the greatest lesson givers in our lives are the people in it. Good, bad, or otherwise, we are learning lessons from the people in our lives all the time. Obviously, a baby newborn needs everything from somebody else. Right? But then eventually they start to mimic mom or dad, right? They're learning lessons as a toddler, or, the 8-year-olds trying to shave like dad, pretend, right? We're learning lessons all the time. That's all part of education. Education is super critical, but I really don't want our students to live and die on whether, figuratively, obviously, on whether they get, 92 on a math test or 94 on a grade 7 math test.
Idolizing their grades.
Brian, do you remember what you got in grade 7 math?
No, but I can say it surely wasn't good.
And there's my point, right? And lessons need to be relearned, but then new lessons need to be learned as well. So education is super critical. But it isn't only measured by the marks you get on a report card. How about that?
Shaun, you mentioned that you always were living a chapter ahead. What is your overarching goal for maybe your career or for HCA?
HCA has gone through an unbelievably transformative period the last 3 years. We know where the rope is. We've actually picked it up and we're pulling more or less in the same direction. But it's early days for HCA, and it breaks my heart. As you know, Brian, the public school system is very stressed in this region. It struggles, and it's not the teachers. The teachers are well-meaning. They got into it for the right reasons. Mm-hmm. The system is, not designed well, if I was to be blunt. And it breaks my heart that students are getting lost. They're kind of the mediocre student. They're not the troublemakers and they're not the high scholars. They just kind of drift through the system. That breaks my heart. And at Halifax Christian, with God's blessing, our goal is to grow, not for numbers, not for revenue growth, but for impact growth. We want to be able to be thought of and practically a landing spot for some of those kids that are going to get lost, and for some of the high scholars that would like to explore some faith while they learn math. And obviously for the younger learners that are just on their journey. So HCA's canvas is, we feel like we've painted a picture, but it's probably the corner of a much larger painting. And it's been a great revival. I sing God's praises every day, and he did it, but he did it through us. And so that's easy. That's multiplication of an amazing blessing that we've been given at Halifax Christian. Personally, the goals, to be honest with you, Brian, are a little more esoteric at the moment. I'm in my early 50s. I have lots of gas. Other than the last month, I have lots of gas left in the tank. Theoretically, I don't know when God's going to call me home, but I've got lots of years left. My heart is to encourage at the moment lots of schools. They all have their own foibles. They all have their own strengths. So I'm looking forward to COVID being in the rear view, travel starting to open up again, so I can start to help a few other schools as well. That's the short term. Definitely looking forward to raising up the next set of leaders at HCA. We're really just starting that process. Using my car in the ditch analogy, the car was in the ditch and on fire at HCA 3.5 years ago. We got it back on the road, and maybe we're not doing 100 miles an hour down the road, but we're clipping along. So now it's time to look forward, raise that up. But personally, I want to be a better dad. I want to be a better husband. I've drawn heavily on the well personally. And I don't exalt the hours I've put in. I've screwed it up. I've pulled too hard over these last 3.5 years, and my family has suffered. They've been very gracious, and it's a family ministry. Both my kids go to the school.
And you have a great wife and wonderful children, 2 daughters.
I sure do. I have 2 amazing girls, 14 and 12. They're both in high school and then middle school.
High school.
Yeah, already. And my wife, Leah, is an amazing, much better person than I'll ever be. She gives me a beacon to strive towards in faith, character. Her heart is bigger than her little body. I really admire her, not just because I'm married to her. I feel blessed. She's working part-time at the school. We gave a little bit of a break to a teacher that was going through some family things, so she's working part-time. So it's really become a family ministry, and that's actually a blessing. We have a common context, which is great, but it can become too immersive.
Yeah.
When you're at your dining room table and all you're talking about is Halifax Christian Academy, that's not good. And I wasn't wise enough to catch it early. So that's actually my goal for this year, if you will. I've had so many twists and turns in my career. I'll never, ever give you a 5-year plan because it's really not worth the paper it's written on, I have to say. I was trained to always have a 5-year plan, but my own life really hasn't rolled that way. So in the short term, reinvesting, rebalancing, the school will be just fine. There's an amazing amount of good people running it underneath me. But I want to reinvest at home this year, first and foremost, and then hopefully past COVID, be able to share I get to speak at conferences and I get to do some work like that. I want to encourage people with even the HCA story. Who would come into a school, 3 or 4 weeks before it was going to be closed? And if that gets some other people dreaming or even hoping just a little bit more, I want to multiply that blessing. So, and not a specific plan. And then ultimately, I'm looking forward to the day when my wife and I can, kind of enjoy the fruits of our labors a little bit more. It's been a heavy lift these last few years. We don't decompress well in this house. household. So I want to get better at that as well.
You might need to pick up a golf club once in a while.
It's sad. I used to be proficient, and now I struggle. I only play once a year, maybe. And so, yeah,
nice golf clubs in Nova Scotia.
It sure is. It's a beautiful spot in the world. Yeah, for anybody that hasn't seen it,
Shaun, you've kind of touched upon this and kind of painted the picture, but is there something about you that people may not understand? And by understanding this, they would have a better appreciation of your work?
Yeah, just that dedication, Brian. I mean, people would see me as a hard worker, but I have an elevated sense of urgency. Sometimes that's a blessing, and sometimes, to be honest, it's a curse. Every day that goes by is a day we don't get to influence anybody. If I choose to stay in bed all day today, I'm not going to get that day back. Mm-hmm. And so I've always had that, and maybe that's come from an early age of living life, a chapter ahead. I get frustrated with people that don't share that urgency. Apathy is the thing that drives me crazy. And for business-minded people, apathy quickly leads to business failure. In a corporate life, it's a little more self-regulating. But we have apathetic husbands and wives. We have apathetic parents in the world. I'm not talking about anything local. We have apathetic learners. We have apathetic government. We have apathy that's what frustrates me, because I see people that have an opportunity to influence, to grow, to produce, and they're never going to get that opportunity back. That day is gone.
Shaun, I interviewed Jeff Diskovic the other day. He spent 16 years in prison being wrongfully convicted of a crime that he didn't do. And that's what he's saying. He comes out of jail and people are just wasting their time. And he spent 16 years of his life behind bars. And that's even the picture. And I wouldn't want to sound like a hypocrite, because I think I'm apathetic at times, is the idea of being a Christian and being bound in sin and then being freed. And then well, what are we doing with our remaining time that we have here on the earth?
Right. I often say to people, taking it out of a faith-based circle or even an organization, if you won the lottery, how many people would you tell? You tell everybody you know, because it's a joyous event, right? Let's just say, I mean, money is not the end all and be all. I've had some, I've had none. Mm-hmm. Burst anybody's bubble that's worshiping at the altar of just money. But you know what? It doesn't hurt to be able to pay the bills, right? So let's just say you won a significant prize, maybe not millions and millions in the lottery, but a significant prize. You tell everybody. Are you telling everybody about the learning that you're doing? Are you telling everybody about, the friendships you're making, the business successes that you're, again, not to be prideful, but just to praise? Ministry, of course, has a whole nother layer on that. The person that's been encouraged by what they're learning, from the Lord, and it's giving them a solid foundation. But we don't tell the world that stuff, and that's my job at HCA, and that's why I'm so committed to it. I get to sing God's praises every single day. The testimonies of my students, which could be 2 sentences in a hallway. Then I reflect back and go, this organization, by human eyes, should have been closed. If sometimes it's useful to not know what you need to know to make some decisions. It took time to find all the data, but by then we were into the turnaround. So yeah, we would celebrate, wouldn't we? When our favorite athletic team scores a goal, what do? We throw up our hands. Do we do that in life? And that would be my challenge to people is test where you're apathetic. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it isn't right to rest, but don't rest there forever, right? Yes, we need to rest, but when it moves to apathy, now your opportunity is drifting away on you.
You're talking about encouragement now, Shaun, and the idea of adversity. Have you faced any adversity where you can turn that into encouragement for others who are facing maybe something similar?
Absolutely. Again, long story, we'll go the short version. We picked up and on God's leading, moved all the way across this continent. We were driving through the US. We decided to do the US highways to see some different territory. And, going from corporate life to ministry life, our material goods had been stripped down quite a bit before we moved. And, the big house was gone and so on and so forth. So really the remnant of our Western Canadian life was packed in a 34-foot long travel trailer and my 1-ton truck, and we were on this big family adventure. We were weaving our way through Middle America and seeing the sights and learning as we went and overcoming some obstacles, flat tires and things like that. And we were leaving northern Kentucky into Ohio and slowed down for a traffic jam. And the next thing you know, we were upside down and a fully loaded 53-foot long semi-trailer didn't stop for the traffic and drove right through the back of us. Flipped our trailer, flipped the truck. The trailer ended up on the truck. We had the interstate shut down for about 6 hours. By God's hand and a miracle, we were protected from significant injury. But all of a sudden, you're already doing something crazy, leaving all the people. I lived in Alberta for almost 40 years. You're leaving all that behind anyway. And now all of a sudden, everything literally is upside down. You have no transport, no accommodation, no clothes, no plan, no friends. You've been working in ministry for a while, so you've got no money. And you're still, 1,500, 2,000 kilometers away from home, from new home. A pretty deep valley, an extremely deep valley. And everything that you thought you owned is now strewn across the interstate. Some of it soaked in diesel fuel. It's a pretty low moment.
Not to mention being there. I told you should have went left. It's like just someone saying, oh.
Yeah. And, but yeah, talk about, obviously that's a trial.
Yeah.
But talking about how living through that trial brought blessing, and there's still residual trauma from that accident. When the first responders come up to me and say, there's absolutely no reason you guys should be alive. Usually when I roll up on something like this, we're calling for the coroner. Mm-hmm. Well, that's a pretty poignant memory. So there's still trauma. And every once in a while, I still get triggered, driving at night when a semi-trailer goes to pass you on the highway, for example. But to give encouragement, we were stranded in northern Kentucky for 9 days. We didn't know, our insurance company was extremely poor. They wouldn't even tell us if we could go get a hotel. And a family put us up in their basement. A family of strangers, happened to be believers, Christians. Well, through that, we got 8 or 9 days of course, people, we needed to rely on the Lord, frankly, but through his people. Well, I can't tell you, Brian, how valuable that lesson is to realize how he showed up in that moment. Now, there's other instances in my life where I was praying he would show up and he chose not to. That doesn't make him mean and vindictive. He's got a bigger plan. Did I really want to get wrecked in northern Kentucky of all places? Nope. Would I change it for the world now? Nope. We have an entire new family who adopted us, quite frankly, and then we adopted them in northern Kentucky. We ministered the gospel. We made lifelong friends. I know in a heartbeat, if we were ever to try and relocate down there, we'd instantly have community. We've already taken a group of kids from Halifax Christian Academy back to that region on mission work. Had the opportunity to go back into that region and encourage others through some public speaking in the Christian circles. Well, none of that would have come about had I clung to my trailer and truck. Would I wish it upon ourselves ever again? No. But if it happened, I'd be able to, at least in the moment, go, hey, I've been here before. And I saw God show up in a mighty, mighty way. Wonder what he's going to do this time. And, for non-believers, obviously, we can come up with a secular example of going through the trials only to see the purpose in the trial later. It's that, I think they call that wisdom. I think they call that maturity. In the moment, no, it was horrible.
Yeah.
But now I wouldn't trade it. And although there's still trauma, and we don't diminish that, we deal with it. And so, yeah, there's the most, at least in the last 4 years, that's the most stark physical, visual, and spiritual challenge we've gone through. So hopefully that's encouraging somebody out there.
Yeah, I was interviewing someone today, and they said, as I mentioned to you before we started recording, and she was reading in a court, she was going through a difficult divorce, and it said, in God we trust, and even this shall pass. Something along those lines. So whatever it may be, even this shall pass.
Yeah.
Is there anything else we haven't touched upon, Shaun? Anything else you wanted to add in particular?
I'm thankful for the opportunity to reconnect with you, Brian, but also just to, if there's one person out of the time we've spent together that's been encouraged, maybe challenged, maybe slightly less apathetic, one organization that actually takes a little bit of time in the busy run of a week to rediscover where the rope lies, to invite everybody to pick it back up and pull again, or an overworking team of executives that really just needs to decompress and have a bit of fun and some joy together and ignore the stock chart for a day. That's my heart. If there's people out there that are in ministry that are despairing and would love to connect privately for some encouragement, I certainly don't have all the wisdom in the world, but he does. Sometimes just knowing somebody else has gone through some hard stuff is encouraging, to somebody that you and I might never meet. So, that's my heart. That's why I was really thankful for the opportunity to sit down with you.
How can people get in touch with you?
Actually, pretty easy. The Influencing Generations for Christ website is gen4 Christ.com. So GEN4Christ.com. That's probably the easiest way. My email's there. I've got a handle on Instagram and a Facebook account, so Messenger as well. Not a big Twitter guy. Too old. I don't know what the problem is there, but anyway, not a big Twitter guy, but Instagram, Facebook, people can get a hold of me. If IGC can help in any way, or I can help in any way, reach out. And just stay strong. I mean, the challenges come, but that's where the growth comes. And if we can set our sights on the other side of the valley, that's where the good sunsets are, on the other side of that valley. You can't see the sunset from the valley or the sunrise. You got to get up onto the hill to see it really well. So, yeah, just a challenge to people to take it on, but don't make the same mistakes I did and immerse yourself so fully you burn out. Then you're no good to anybody.
Shaun, I have one final question for you.
Yeah.
And that is, why do you work?
Yeah, I thought you might ask that, Brian, actually, being a fan of your podcast. Why do I work? I work because, quite frankly, I have things that I think should be shared. And I don't want to hoard them. I want to share them. And through working, through not just paid work, but volunteer work, we can share the gifts we've been given. People can learn so they don't have to maybe make some of the mistakes you and I have learned. But we also are so blessed. We get to learn from everybody else we interact with. And there's a lot more of them than there is us. And so when you're working, when you're pulling on the rope together, it's a blessed time when the best of us can come out. And we're all flawed. But if we took the best of you, the best of me, and the best of, say, 10 others, and we're working together, now we have the best of the best. And it's one of the, outside the family, it's one of the rare occasions where people spend a substantial amount of their waking hours focused on accomplishing a common goal. And that's the blessing of work.
Shaun Alspach, head of the school at the Halifax Christian Academy, and the vice president of Influencing Generations for Christ. Thank you for your time, and I appreciate the work that you do.
It's a privilege, Brian, to be with you. We miss you back here in Canada, but we know you're doing great things there in Korea.